Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to talk about inflation, that invisible force that's always messing with our wallets, our paychecks, and pretty much our whole lives. We're going to dig into its wild and turbulent history right here in the US.
Okay, let's rewind a little bit to June of 2022. You remember that feeling, right? That absolute sticker shock at the gas pump? That grocery bill that just seemed to defy gravity? Well, it wasn't just in your head. The data confirmed it. Prices were surging at a 9.1% clip, the fastest we'd seen in 40 years.
A jump that sharp makes you wonder, doesn't it? Was this totally out of the blue? Was it the worst it's ever been? Well, as we're about to see, when you look at the real history of American inflation, our recent experience is just one chapter in a much crazier story.
But before we jump in that time machine, let's just do a quick level set and make sure we all know what we're talking about. What is inflation anyway? So in simple terms, inflation is when prices for pretty much everything go up, and your dollar just doesn't stretch as far as it used to. The way economists measure it is actually pretty smart. They use this idea of a market basket. Just picture a shopping cart filled with all the typical stuff an average household buys, milk, gas, rent, a phone bill. They track the total cost of that basket over time. So if it costs more this year than last year, that's inflation. It's basically a snapshot of the rising cost of, living.
Now you might think, hey, falling prices sound pretty good to me, but the opposite of inflation, something called deflation, can be an absolute catastrophe. Seriously, think about it. If you knew that new car you want was going to be cheaper next month, what would you do? You'd wait. Now imagine if everybody starts waiting to buy things. The whole economy just grinds to a halt. It's why, weirdly enough, a little bit of steady inflation is actually seen as a sign of a healthy economy.
All right, basics covered. Let's get to the history. Because when you look at the most extreme, eye-watering price surges in US history, one thing jumps out at you almost every single time: war.
And our first stop is a big one. We're going back more than a century, to the chaotic days right after World War I. This period holds the all-time undisputed record for the worst inflation the modern U.S. has ever seen. Get ready for this. In June of 1920, the annual inflation rate hit an astronomical 23.7%. Let that sink in. That is more than 2.5 times the peak we just saw in 2022. It was a complete economic shockwave.
So, why did this happen? Well, this quote from a Bureau of Labor Statistics economist just nails it. The entire American economy had been retooled for the war. Factories that used to make appliances were making munitions. Farms were feeding soldiers, not families. So back home, there was just less stuff for everyone else. And when you have way less supply but the same amount of demand, prices have nowhere to go but through the roof. And you might think, okay, that was a crazy one-off event. Not at all. Let's fast forward a few decades to the end of World War II, and you'll see the exact same pattern, but with a really fascinating twist. Between March 1946 and March 1947, the country got slammed by another monster wave of inflation. This time, prices shot up by over 20%, the second highest rate we have on record.
So what was the twist this time? Well, it wasn't just about shortages during the war. See, throughout WWI, the government had put a lid on the economy, with strict price controls and rationing for everybody. So for years, Americans were saving money like crazy because there was nothing to buy. When the war ended and those controls were lifted, it was like a dam breaking. A tidal wave of cash flooded the market. Everyone wanted new cars, new homes, new everything. The only problem? Industry couldn't just flip a switch from making tanks back to making toasters. So once again, you had way too much money chasing way too few goods.
Okay, so we've seen these short, violent inflation spikes after wars. But that brings us to a period that's burned into the memory of a whole generation. A time when high inflation wasn't a temporary shock. It became a persistent, decade-long economic nightmare.
It's known as the Great Inflation, and it lasted from about the mid-1960s to the early 80s. This wasn't just a blip, it was a stubborn, grinding crisis that fundamentally changed how America thinks about economic policy and the role of the Federal Reserve.
The 70s also gave us a miserable new word for our vocabulary: stagflation. See, you usually expect inflation to be high when the economy is booming, but this was the exact opposite. You had a stagnant, slow economy with high unemployment, and you had runaway prices at the same time. It was, quite literally, the worst of both worlds.
And what was the main villain of this story? It was a devastating one-two punch from global energy markets. First, in 1973, an oil embargo by Arab nations made the price of oil quadruple, basically overnight. Then, just as things were settling, the Iranian Revolution in 1979 caused another massive supply shock, nearly tripling prices again. And since energy is a key ingredient in almost everything we make and do, the cost of everything soared.
By March of 1980, inflation had peaked at almost 15%. People were losing faith in the economy. There was a very real feeling that the country was just spiraling out of control.
It was at this moment of crisis that the Federal Reserve, led by its brand-new, tough-as-nails chairman, Paul Volcker, decided it was time for some very harsh medicine.
The Fed unleashed what became known as the Volcker shock. They cranked up interest rates to an unbelievable 20%. I mean, can you even imagine that? The goal was to make borrowing money so painfully expensive that it would slam the brakes on spending and cool the economy down. And it worked, but the side effects were brutal. It triggered a deep recession and unemployment skyrocketed. But in the end, the back of inflation was finally broken.
That painful but ultimately successful treatment ushered in a new, remarkably peaceful economic era, one that would last for nearly a generation.
Economists actually call this period the Great Moderation. For almost 40 years after Volcker, inflation was low, stable, and kind of boring, honestly. It just faded into the background. And that long period of quiet is exactly why the sudden explosion in prices after the COVID pandemic felt so profoundly jarring to so many of us.
And what's really fascinating is that when you look at the causes, you can see the echoes of history repeating. We had that massive wave of pent-up demand after lockdowns ended, which was a lot like the spending boom after World War II. And we had those massive global supply chain disruptions, which felt a whole lot like a modern-day version of the 1970s oil shocks.
This summary here just puts it all into perfect perspective. You can see each major inflationary wave, its peak, and its primary driver. And what becomes so clear is that while the specific triggers were different, a war, an oil embargo, a global pandemic, the root cause was always the same: a massive, sudden shock to the fundamental balance of supply and demand.
And that, really, is the crucial takeaway. The numbers change, the headlines are different, but the underlying economic forces are timeless. The post-pandemic surge seems to be cooling down, but history teaches us that new shocks are always just over the horizon. So the only question left is, what's going to trigger the next wave, and will we be ready for it?